Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Carol Willis, Chief Executive of the National Foundation for Educational Research, or NFER. And I wanted to thank you all for joining us today. This is the third in a series of policy webinars being organised by NFER. And our aim with this series has been to explore some of the key issues facing education in advance of the general election. We're concerned that despite the scale of challenges, education could be drowned out in election debates. The economy, health, immigration and defence are all above education in the YouGov tracker on important issues facing the country. So we're drawing on our research to focus a spotlight on education, ensuring that the public are properly informed about the issues and that they are challenging politicians from all parties to address them in their manifestos and their plans for government. If the country can't provide a proper high quality education for all our children, then there will be longer term consequences for economic growth, social mobility and for living standards. We've already run webinars on teacher supply and on school funding, which you can find on our website. And today we're focusing on disadvantage. And later in the year, we'll also be looking at skills. So I very much hope you'll be able to join us for that session too. You might also want to put the 20th of March in your diaries, when we'll be running a webinar on the teacher labour market, providing the findings from our latest annual review of teacher pay and working conditions. But we have a great group of panelists today. Thank you all so much for joining us. So I'll hand over now to our chair, Jon Severs.
Thank you, Carol. My name's Jon Severs. I'm editor of Tes Magazine. I've been at Tes for an amazing 11 years now. But in that time, we worked with NFER closely, and we hugely appreciate the work they do in the sector, particularly around workforce and disadvantage. So it's a pleasure to be asked to host today. The way it's going to work is each of the panelists will get 5 minutes each to give some overview thoughts on the theme, which is tackling the disadvantage gap, as Carol said. We'll then go into some discussion on those points, and then we'll finish with a Q&A. So if you have got questions from the initial presentations from the panel or as part of the discussion, please do put them in the Q&A and we'll try and get to them at the end. So I'll give you a quick introduction before we kick off to the different panelists. So we've got Dr. Ben Stiles, Head of Classroom Practice and Workforce at NFER. We've got Louise Murphy, Economist at the Resolution Foundation. We've got Abby Jitendra. Sorry, I knew I'd stumble. Sorry, Abby. Abby Jitendra, Principal Policy Advisor at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and Jessica Prestidge, Deputy Policy Director at the Centre for Social Justice. So, Abby, I'm going to come to you first for your 5 minutes thoughts on the disadvantage gap.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. Hopefully everyone can hear and see me. Well, it's really brilliant to be here, and it's really brilliant to go first because I'm definitely not an expert on the kind of disadvantage attainment gap. My background is very much in currently on care policy and previously on welfare and poverty. But I think it's very difficult to understand attainment and attainment inequalities without first understanding the reality of sort of material deprivation in this country. So just to set the scene, I mean, incomes and prices, as we know, are really bearing down on people and families, and are leading to a huge amount of pressure for many. So we found that 7 million households would have to double their pay just to reach the poverty line. That was recent data from our UK poverty report that we put out every year that came out just a few weeks ago. And I think that sets the scene for the kind of broader world that families are living in, that we know leads to poor educational outcomes. If you don't have food in your belly, it's very hard to concentrate at school. If you haven't got the right uniform, it's very hard to feel like you are sort of, a part of the school community. And we know that income has a very direct link with attainment. And I currently work on childcare, and what we see is even at the kind of youngest years, in the early years, those educational disparities have already emerged. By the age of 4 or 5, you already see those disparities emerge. So it is really there is something about the way that we are sort of structuring support, wages, benefits to families that is sort of leading to disparities in those very earliest years. Just a few headline kind of stats from our or kind of reflections from our UK poverty report, just to again slightly set more of the scene on what we mean again by disadvantage. So we see year after year kind of looking at families that larger families and single parents are most likely to be disadvantaged, and also disabled families with a disabled family member in them. And a huge part of that is work. So if you have caring responsibilities and you tend to have fewer time to do sort of paid work, and so you have less income and more mouths to feed. So there is something about fixing the kind of money input into households, looking at benefits, looking at wages, the availability of part-time work, and how well it's paid. I mean, these are all sort of standard kind of pieces of a kind of social policy when we think about poverty. But again, still a really long way to go on that. And but we also see that in-work poverty is really kind of determining. So Action for Children have a brilliant piece of analysis out looking at how 300,000 families are in poverty and in work. And actually, when you look at the cohort of families in work poverty, sorry, of people in work poverty, families are disproportionately a kind of a feature of that. And again, that's to do with very low paid work, not being able to progress in work, or being in part-time work that we know is paid less well. So that's disadvantage. Now moving to sort of attainment and focusing specifically on childcare, where JRF has been doing work with Quorum and others. So childcare is obviously not the kind of full picture, but childcare and early education is a really good opportunity at the earliest stage of a child's life to try and intervene in those disparities, which, as I said, and as I'm sure we all know, have already emerged by the time a child is going to school. And we looked at the literature on how you can make childcare best work to tackle disadvantage, and that there is research out there on this, even though current government policy is not focused on childcare as tackling disadvantage beyond helping parents in work, which is a really important part of it. There is lots of literature on how you can make childcare a kind of disadvantage tackling a kind of service. So just really quickly, there are 5 things that we found. The first one is to make sure childcare is affordable. It's completely obvious, and a kind of basic thing that we need childcare to actually be something that you can afford in order to use it. There's a whole other webinar that we could do about childcare and the reforms and expansion. I'll leave others to look at the news and others to see how that's going. But what we know is childcare currently is not affordable for many people. The reforms that are going to be coming in this year and next will make it a bit more affordable for some, but for the very lowest paid on universal credit, they actually won't make much of a difference. That was what our research found. So there's more to be done on affordability. Then there's another key part is access. So do you have appropriate childcare near you? Do you have support that is again appropriate to your SEND sort of requirements as well? And is it a welcoming place? Would you want to send your child there? Another one, and this is really crucial, and definitely for this kind of room, is quality. So we have a good sense of what quality looks like, and Ofsted does a good job of kind of assessing some of it. But again, there's more that we could do, and a big part of that is paying childcare professionals and educators more, because the more sort of graduates or more experience you have, the more sort of high quality support you can get to people. So that's the kind of childcare bit. But just really quickly, we know that there's only so much that a service can do, and a big part of it is what that service is linking into, and other kind of parts of the terrain of a child's life. So the 2 other things that we found were really determining. The first one was the home learning environment. So how is a child's parent sort of speaking to them, playing with them, engaging with them, and how can childcare workers sort of speak to parents, engage with them to improve that. Again, more sort of ephemeral, but as we know, a really crucial thing to sort of level those kind of developmental inequalities. And then finally, linking to other services. So this is what Sure Start did very well many years ago, is link a whole bunch of different support services in a kind of hub space, place-based model to support families, low-income families in particular. And you have some of that with family hubs, but is there more that we could do to have something place-based that links people into sort of health services, other kinds of kind of support services that they could get, as well as childcare? So that's my piece, and I'm really keen to hear from others.
Thank you, Abby. Jessica, over to you.
Thanks very much. So my name's Jess. I'm Deputy Policy Director at the Centre for Social Justice. And I'm also not an education specialist, but the CSJ is focused on rectifying disadvantage, and obviously education is a huge part of that broader policy question. So today I'm going to briefly outline how I see the politics of the attainment gap playing out ahead of a general election. Then I'm going to talk specifically about attendance or absence. We've seen a huge spike in absence since the COVID lockdowns, which obviously has very significant implications in terms of attainment. And then following on from that, I'm going to talk about parental engagement, which is something that the CSJ has talked quite a lot about for a while now. But starting with the politics, the government will want to tell us that everything was going swimmingly until COVID hit. Obviously, we know that's not entirely true. The attainment gap had started to close, but there were signs that this was stalling from 2019 onward. They'll want to emphasise the success of their standards agenda more broadly, the PISA league tables, phonics, the number of schools rated, Ofsted rated good and outstanding. The government's most significant recent intervention on the attainment gap has been the National Tutoring Programme, which I think it's fair to say hasn't been an unmitigated success. And I wouldn't expect to see a huge amount more from the Conservatives on the attainment gap ahead of a general election. I think their big kind of political push in the education space is going to be around technical and vocational education and skills. On the other side of the House, Labour will point to the attainment gap as symptomatic of government's broader failure in relation to education policy. Bridget Phillipson has identified closing the attainment gap as a priority for a future Labour government. As a North East MP herself, I think her perspective is likely to be coloured by regional attainment gaps. And Labour has been pretty clear that they see the early years as critical to closing the attainment gap, as kind of Abby was saying just now. So the two particular areas I want to focus on, starting with attendance. And this matters because patterns of absence are feeding attainment gaps. Since the pandemic, we've seen severe absence rise from about 60,000 to 140,000. Severely absent children are missing at least 50% of their school time. Persistent absence, meanwhile, has risen from about 900,000 to just under 1.5 million. Having peaked at around 1.7 million. So really significant increases. Persistently absent children miss at least 10% of their school time. And research published by the Children's Commissioner has found that just 5% of children who missed over half of their school time went on to achieve grade 4s or above in their GCSEs, including English and maths. The equivalent figure is 36% for persistently absent children and 78% for children who were rarely absent. And children in receipt of free school meals are more likely to be absent. Their outcomes are also more acutely affected by absent. So children in receipt of free school meals are about 3 times more likely to be severely absent and twice as likely to be persistently absent than children who aren't eligible for free school meals. And among children eligible for free school meals and persistently absent, 28% passed at least 5 GCSEs, including maths and English. Of those not eligible for free school meals and persistently absent, the figure is 47%. So the numbers are really quite stark. What's government doing about it? What should a future government be doing about it? So there have been some positive steps in the right direction. Piloting attendance mentors, for example, publishing attendance guidance, which emphasises the importance of a multi-agency approach, and producing and publishing richer absence data. So all that's really good stuff, but we at the CSJ don't think government is going far enough. We think attendance mentors should be rolled out nationally, that the attendance guidance should be put on a statutory footing. And we think there needs to be some proper research and evaluation into the efficacy of fines, because at the moment they're being used without any real understanding of the impact that they have. But what I want to focus on specifically now is parental engagement, which is something the CSJ has championed for quite a long time. Because school is only ever going to be part of the answer, and teachers are already being asked to do more and more. Now, asking schools to engage parents is clearly another thing to put on their to-do lists. But I suppose our argument here would be that it can relieve pressure in a load of other ways. It's a force multiplier and feeds into the home learning environment, which we know is really critical to improving children's outcomes. Higher levels of parental engagement are associated with improved attendance and attainment, and disadvantaged children are likely to see the biggest gains. I can't remember it all off the top of my head, but there's some really interesting EEF research, which I think shows that among children eligible for free school meals, parental engagement can add 4 months to attainment at primary school. And parental engagement is more important now than ever before, because for some parents, the COVID lockdowns appear to have broken the contract of trust between schools and families. And it will be very hard to get children back to school until parents are fully bought in and really believe that kind of every day of school matters. This is central to Labour's narrative on education. When we had Bridget Phillipson at the CSJ last month to give a speech, she spoke about the relationship between schools, families and government changing for the worse over the course of successive Conservative governments. Now, I have some reservations about this as kind of an overarching narrative. Our own research shows that on the whole, the relationship between most parents and most schools is good. But there is a significant minority of parents who don't enjoy a good relationship with their child's school, who don't feel confident that their child's school is meeting their child's needs. And we think that this needs to be a priority. Recent CSJ polling found that 28% of parents think it's not essential for their child to attend school every day. 35% of parents said they're worried about their child's performance and would like more support from their child's school. And that rises to 42% among low-income households. And 30% of parents could not tell us they were confident that their child's school was meeting their child's needs. Now, obviously, unpicking those findings is really complicated. Is it about constraints on resource? Is it a lack of SEND provision? Is it a matter of communication between a child's school and parents? It's an unsatisfying answer, but we don't know yet. It's not something the CSJ has got to the bottom to, but levels of absence will remain hard to shift, while a significant minority of parents remain ambivalent about the importance of school. And this is something that we need to get to the bottom of if we're going to close the attainment gap. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jess. Louise, over to you.
Morning, everyone. My name is Louise Murphy, and I'm an economist at the Resolution Foundation. And I'll hopefully build on what we've heard so far by focusing on a slightly different angle, which is, broadly speaking, kind of education for young people in that sort of post-16 stage. So thinking sort of more specifically about further and higher education, which is where Resolution Foundation has done most of its work, really thinking about, you know, what are the impacts of education and qualifications on people's living standards and their transition into the world of work. And I'll broadly think about disadvantage in 3 strands. First of all, thinking a bit about equality and maybe disadvantage, how we would, you know, think about it most commonly, before then briefly touching on what this means for growth and our kind of country overall. And then finally finishing with some thoughts about how education and health are linked. So to start with, we've been thinking, about the kind of big question, which is, which groups of young people are disadvantaged in the UK when it comes to progressing into further education after they leave secondary school. And really, it's those young people that aren't on track to go to university. So broadly speaking, if you choose to go down that university path, and often that means you've achieved good GCSEs and A-levels, you've got a pretty clear future ahead of you. Broadly speaking, you're guaranteed a place, and the process for applying to university is pretty clear-cut in the UK. But for young people thinking about non-university pathways, the future, that transition is much more chaotic, both in terms of sort of the mechanics of the application. There's no kind of easy UCAS application that teachers can walk them through, but also in terms of the reality. So we know when it comes to college, further education, we've seen huge real terms cuts in the past decade. For example, the budget for post-16 college further education is about 50% of what it was in 2010. So huge cuts over the last decade. And what that means is that young people just aren't guaranteed that there'll be a college near them that is offering the course that they want to do. Similarly, when we think about apprenticeships, there's much more uncertainty for young people thinking about apprenticeships than those young people thinking about going to university. We've seen huge decreases in the number of apprenticeship starts for young people under 25, and particularly for those people starting lower level apprenticeships, with the kind of quite well covered rise in degree apprenticeships, which are increasingly going towards existing employees, so people that are already in the workforce who might have a link with an employer who are benefiting from those apprenticeships. And when we speak to young people, as we've done recently, we've been doing some qualitative work, speaking to these young people that are, disadvantaged and that they're not on track to go to university. This feeling of disadvantage and uncertainty really comes through loud and clear. For example, we heard from one young person saying, they applied for one apprenticeship, that was all that was on offer, and when they didn't get that apprenticeship, they just felt as if, the rug had been pulled out from under them. They just had no idea what they could do next. I'll kind of quickly just touch on two related points, and one is, what does this state of affairs mean for the country? What does a Britain that has such a state of disadvantage for these young people not set for university, what does that mean for our country? And I think the big picture answer is, it means, we don't have enough young people getting the qualifications, the non-university qualifications that we need if we want to increase our productive sectors. So we did some work recently looking at some of the most productive parts of the UK economy, for example, life sciences, business and finance, and our creative industries. And what we found is that, broadly speaking, we have about the right number of young people with degrees to fill the jobs that we need in these sectors. But what came out really strongly is that we've got too many people with very low levels of qualifications. For example, just a GCSE or similar, but we don't have enough people with sort of mid-level qualifications. So that would be, an HND or an HNC equivalent, the sort of things that you can, or historically would get by doing a college course or an apprenticeship. And, of course, if we want to get out of the stagnation that the country is in and really kind of, get back to a period of productivity growth, I think it is important that skills and training and education is part of that conversation. And just finally, the other lens through which we've been thinking about education and disadvantage is health, and this big sort of trend or theme that's been emerging since the COVID-19 pandemic in particular, which is we've got growing numbers of people out of the workforce due to health problems and disabilities. And although maybe in the news we've heard a lot about older workers not working due to ill health, what we've also seen is that, you know, this trend is also true when we look at young people. The number of 18 to 24-year-olds not working due to ill health has doubled in the last decade and now stands at around 200,000. And I think it's pretty much impossible to think about that trend without also thinking about education and disadvantage. So quite shockingly, 4 in 5 of those young people that are not working due to ill health don't have a qualification above GCSE level, which is much higher than even unemployed young people, and of course much higher than the overall population of 18 to 24-year-olds. So, you know, when it comes to what we can do about that, we've been thinking about some policy solutions, and we're actually publishing some work on Monday next week with some of the answers. But, you know, it really, I think the short summary is that we should be thinking about health and education holistically. So, for example, when it comes to supporting young people to retake GCSEs, we should really be providing better wraparound support so that you know, young people can get support with both their mental health and their education at such an important part of their life. So yeah, hopefully that sort of summarises those 3 broad trends through which we've been thinking about these issues.
Thank you, Louise. Last but not least, Dan, to Ben now. Cheers, Ben.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm going to start with a kind of general take, which actually touches on what we've heard from Louise, Jessica and Abby already, and then I'm going to focus in on a little bit more what we do at NFER. So the first question to ask is within the education space is, of course, have we got the measure right? Is the eligibility for free school meals measure appropriate for identifying these children? And there is an argument to suggest that we should be looking at educational disadvantage rather than economic disadvantage. Poverty is a poor proxy for educational and social disadvantage, actually, and particularly with the work we do, you know, what can schools influence if not educational disadvantage? It might be tempting to say, well, okay, free school meals measure is relatively straightforward. It has this eligibility threshold in terms of family income, but actually it's getting increasingly problematic because of the changes to universal credit. They allow someone to continue to be eligible for free school meals until the end of the rollout or the end of primary and secondary school. And of course, the threshold itself has been the same since 2018. And with all the inflationary cost of living pressures, you know, that is also skewing any between-year comparisons of the disadvantage gap, for example. So we need to consider that as a basis for any further discussion in terms of education. We also need to acknowledge that aspects of the existing system are stacked against disadvantaged pupils. I'm thinking of things like ability grouping. So that's school level selection, so 11+, which still exists in plenty of towns and cities across England, but also within school. So setting and streaming, very common within school activities of ability grouping in secondary school. We know that grouping people by table in primary school can be actually beneficial, but in secondary school it's not so good for disadvantaged children. We also had all the school closures during the pandemic. I'll touch on that in a bit. And of course the levels of persistent absence that we've already heard about from Jessica that ensued since the pandemic, all unfairly disadvantaging the already disadvantaged children. And we must make a nod to teacher recruitment and retention, which of course is harder for schools in disadvantaged areas. You know, they are the ones that find it hardest to recruit and retain teachers. So again, disadvantaged children are getting a raw deal. And then also before we home in on education, we must acknowledge the wider influences other than just what can happen in schools, other than just pedagogy, which we spent a lot of our time doing at NFER. And we've already heard, in fact, from Abby about poverty, from Louise about mental health, but I was going to take mental health as an example. So we know that there is an increase from 1 in 9 to 1 in 6 instances of probable mental health disorders in children in England over the pandemic, and that increase has been maintained from the latest survey. And we also know from some groundbreaking work done at King's College London that if you link the NPD, the National Pupil Database, with hospital episode records, you'll see that if you are a depressed, seriously depressed adolescent, then you're looking at half a standard deviation, lower GCSE scores on average when you do the modelling, controlling for other factors. This is roughly 10 times as large as what you would typically get in an education trial. So we have to ask ourselves, are we focusing on the right things when that is such a problematic contributor to academic attainment? For example, there are many others. So just briefly then on the work that we do in this area, and how that might influence policy decisions. So one of the things we've been doing is tracking the attainment gap since the pandemic. We've been tracking a cohort of year 1 and year 2 children all the way through as they progress. And the latest results from last autumn in reading for years 3 and 4 says that the disadvantage gap is still 7 months wide, 7 months progress wide. It's not decreased since the spring of 2021, and it's still wider than it was before the pandemic. Many of you will be familiar with that story. In maths, it has reduced slightly since spring 2021, but it is still wider than the gap was before the pandemic. So that sort of agrees with a lot of other studies. We've already heard mention of the government solution to that, the National Tutoring Programme, and Jessica's sort of summary of the results in terms of impact were appropriate, in the sense that, I mean, our latest evaluation, which was for the second year of the programme, there's a long wait for the data to come through, but that indicated at most a month extra progress for the pupil premium children as a result of the school-led tutoring arm of the National Tutoring Programme. So compared to the sort of, it's all about implementation, right? So the existing evidence on tutoring was strong, at least in terms of reading recovery. But when you scale it up like that, it is more challenging to get results. So we must acknowledge the role of tutoring within the wider pupil premium spend. It should continue to be an option for schools. The only trial I've worked on which had a seriously large impact was a tutoring trial. So, I know from firsthand experience how useful it can be if implemented in the right way. But of course, all the work the EEF have done with their toolkit is still very useful for this particular question of how you improve attainment for pupil premium children, and the latest move towards decisions teachers make in the classroom through teacher choices is also going to be potentially very beneficial. But as I say, we have to ask questions around whether our focus is appropriate, given the nature of the measure changing, given these wider influences on the child, and these the other aspects that they are disadvantaged, as we discuss what might be the best way to, or should I say the most cost-effective way to improve outcomes for disadvantaged children.
Thank you, Ben. So over the four presentations there, we saw some key themes come up. So like poverty as an influencer of likely to attend school, an influencer on SEND, behaviour, early childhood, accessibility to outcome routes from school, impact on health. And then we also had some discussion on the viability, if you like, of the metric we're using for disadvantage. And then Ben at the end there, talked about what schools can control. So if we're talking about tackling disadvantage in relation to schools, I think the first question is whether we need to separate what impact poverty has. So what manifestations of disadvantage that we see in schools are a poverty intervention, and what can schools do without that poverty intervention, if that makes sense. So like I think if we come to you first, Abby, you talked about early childhood and what can be achieved in early childhood. Are we mitigating for poverty? Do you need a system whereby poverty is being mitigated at the same time as the education is mitigating those effects? Or can schools actually meaningfully make an impact at that, or early year settings make a meaningful impact without the corresponding poverty solution?
I mean, it's a really tricky question. I think if you want to make a measurable difference, you have to have a sort of pincer move. But yeah, I'm definitely not a fatalist in this space. There's clearly so much that kind of educational settings can do. So one of the things that we identified was in our work with Quorum was the really good practice of early years educators speaking to parents and sort of having the kind of learnings from what does good play that also helps children learn. What does that look like, and speaking to parents about it so that they can sort of take that learning into their homes. So there's definitely a kind of wider piece there, again linking up with other services. That's not solving the low levels of universal credit. That is literally knitting together what is available locally in many cases already. So a lot of what civil society is already doing or public services are doing, often the individual family is the node, but they are having to engage with all of these different services. Whereas we know from lots of evidence that if you have one-stop shops or services kind of knitted together already for you, it's much easier to access that support. But again, saying that, my background is welfare policy and poverty and sort of public services. Like I don't think there is a way to make a real meaningful difference without also looking at persistent low pay in a kind of specific occupations, social care being one. Care more generally is a very sort of undervalued and underpaid profession, and many people doing it have caring responsibilities themselves. And so we really cannot hope to make a measurable difference without improving pay there. Universal credit is also another one. Lots of low pay, kind of low paid professions are basically topped up by universal credit, and it's not to a very high kind of amount. And so there's something there about benefits adequacy, work allowances, all the techie things in universal credit that you need to fix in order to really get more money in people's pockets. And then the final bit, I also used to work on energy. Prices have been really volatile. Obviously, energy prices are down now, but there's so much more that you can do via kind of regulated kind of utilities or other kinds of price controls. Rent is obviously the rent and housing payments are the biggest expense for families. So there's a whole bunch of things that you need to do in the kind of housing market and the private rented sector particularly to make an impact. So it's a whole bunch of different things, but I would not say that education, it does not have a really kind of determining effect, because we know that it can sort of slice through a lot of these and give people brilliant outcomes.
Ben, I'm going to put you on the spot slightly here, because I don't know if this data exists, but can we see that as poverty increases, school outcomes decrease essentially, or is education able to mitigate those rises in poverty?
Well, I mean, so what we do know is that there is considerable overlap between the poverty measure and what we might term educational disadvantage. So, it's not complete over. That was my kind of original point. So, if you're going to help children who are educationally disadvantaged, if you put your measure on economic disadvantage and you solve that problem, you solve the poverty problem in the loosest possible sense, then you will still get a lot of improvement. It's just that there'll be other children in there who you're missing potentially by just defining it through economic disadvantage. But clearly, you solve a big problem if you can make the poverty issue less of a problem for those children.
Do you think politically, considering that and what you were talking about all the pedagogical things we can do in a school, do you think that we have to be slightly careful in this election cycle, or rather politicians have to be slightly careful about how they word closing the disadvantage gap, because it's always put on the schools. Yet we're talking about a series of measures here that, as we've discussed, will have an effect, but a limited effect. Yet all the onus of the political onus, at least, is on the school itself as the agent of change.
Yeah, so it's important to realise that schools, you know, they have a limited impact on you know, they can only influence attainment up to a certain point because of all these wider factors. And you know, to be fair though, there are research projects ongoing that look at wider influence. There are these panel surveys the Department for Education is funding that look at you know, the wider influences on the child, and so you know, they are looking at that as well as what goes on in the classroom. But you know, it is important to acknowledge that of course we are limited for all the reasons we've heard around how much impact we can have just by what teachers do and you know, what they choose to use in the EVE toolkit, for example.
And Louise, it was really interesting how you were talking about the limited options post-16 for disadvantaged kids. And what struck me was that the failure of the system at that point has a knock-on ripple effect on the wider engagement. Like if the eldest child doesn't get out, then the faith in the education system depletes with the children after that, and we have this multi-generational effect. And one of the things Jess was talking about was, you know, this social contract with education, that it can change a life. I just wondered if you could elaborate on that a little bit and talk about the ripple effect of those lack of outcomes, if you like.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I think in some ways it makes it all the more important that we do act while children are still in, and young people are still in compulsory education, because as you say, you know, if we don't act, there's all these consequences. For example, I mean, one thing we've thought about, it's fairly obvious, but just what that means for people's employment outcomes. And we know that in the UK, actually the impact of not getting anything above GCSE on your future earnings is actually even bigger than some of our kind of comparator countries like France or Germany. So overall, young people with nothing above GCSE earn roughly 40%, so 2/5 of their kind of graduate counterparts, whereas in France and Germany, that stands at around 2/3, sort of 65%. So actually the penalty, if we think of it like that way, of not getting you know, sort of tertiary or further education is really severe when it comes to your future earnings. And also just the other, I think, important thing, which is straightforward, but I think sometimes missing in these discussions, is just the UK, again, the way that our system is, it's pretty one shot, if we like to think of it that way, that very few adults catch up and get kind of GCSE A-level equivalent qualifications into their 20s. So really, if we want to kind of think about how we can, you know, really support people to get good qualifications and therefore kind of have, you know, better, more fulfilling, better paid careers, that intervention ultimately needs to happen at a younger age.
And we got a question from Emily in the Q&A about a post-16 premium, so some form of additional funding post-16. I think this is an interesting one because the famous Heckman curve is always interpreted as, oh, we should put our investment in early years. But if you talk to Heckman, he says, no, you've got to sustain that funding across the lifetime of school. So I guess it's an interesting one for you and Abby to sort of elaborate on, because Abby's focused on early years, you on post-16 here. Like, how do we see the distribution of funding post-election that would have the biggest impact on disadvantage? Like, should we be equally putting our more money at both ends, or is there a trade-off? If there is a trade-off, where should we go? So I guess I'll come to you first, Louise, and then if you could follow afterwards, Abby.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I think you know, something that I think we should all be grappling more with, given, you know, any investment in this space is going to have to be, I'm sure, kind of carefully justified. So, you know, everything will come with trade-offs. I mean, I think the short answer is they're not mutually exclusive, or kind of investing in one place has knock-on consequences across kind of the education landscape. You know, putting more investment in early years will benefit, you know, our next generation of 16 to 18-year-olds. But I think, I mean, our take would really be, you know, that post-16 kind of education funding just has ultimately suffered over the past few decades, and perhaps is a bit less headline grabbing, maybe, at least at the moment, than childcare, is something which does, you know, seems to be kind of in the kind of political debate a little bit more at the moment. And I think just thinking about investment in colleges and post-16 settings is important, ultimately, if we're thinking about disadvantage, because that is where disadvantaged young people end up. So, for example, if we think about young people resetting maths and English GCSE, like they're much more concentrated in colleges than in secondary schools. So I just think kind of thinking about the setting type, and not just lumping together kind of schools, colleges, or kind of education in all together, but really thinking about, you know, what's the issue we're tackling, and if that is something like, you know, and something that we've been thinking of, you know, making sure more people have, you know, a good GCSE qualifications as they enter the workforce, then to solve that question, I think really does involve focusing on colleges. But then I'm sure there's other very big policy questions or aims where the focus really deserves to be on kind of primary schools and early years settings.
Abby?
Yeah, I'd love to say I completely disagree, because that would make this conversation much more interesting. But I think I completely agree with you, Louise. I don't think it's mutually exclusive. I guess one thought from me is we have a massive investment in childcare. We've just had the biggest kind of investment in childcare that we've ever seen. Billions more going into the system. It's going to be worth about over 5 billion in the next year. And so I think the question is not where should we invest, but I think the question is how should we invest. And the thing that we hear repeatedly from the kind of early years sector is it's all about quality. It's all about having, you know, expert and or experienced educators who are not paid poverty wages, which they currently are. And that is what is going to get you the most bang for your buck in those early years. It's not just throwing money to expand. It's also we need funding to deepen experience and expertise, and that's the thing that's going to matter. I'd also add just one other thought to the sort of post-16 kind of outlook. Completely agree with you, Louise, that sort of colleges and FE is really important. Obviously, we know that educational disadvantage doesn't stop once you turn 18. If you go to university, we know that more disadvantaged students are less likely to leave with a good degree and more likely to drop out. And so clearly there's something about a kind of holistic support system that we need. Nothing new there. I think people have been saying this for a very long time, and some of the work being done around pupil premium is obviously really brilliant. But yeah, I wouldn't want to lose the fact that kind of disadvantage and kind of disadvantage and attainment, it has these kind of long roots, but also these kind of tall branches as well.
Thank you. Ben, here's one for you. Can you define educational disadvantage, and at the same time give us your top bet to tackling educational disadvantage? Not a small question, but I reckon you can take it on.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not a small question at all. I mean, so we are as well as the poverty component, we are talking about children that are struggling with the basic literacy and numeracy as they start school, for example, as well. That's the key further element which you lose when you justify it through economic disadvantage. But I would, in terms of how we tackle this, I would just make a plug for Jessica's point about absence as she had to leave us early. This is clearly a big growing problem in terms of persistent absence. There's not, from a research point of view, there's very little work going on. We work on a project at NFER concerning schools' approach to internal alternative provision, so the keeping children in school that might otherwise end up in a PRU or whatever. And it's the exception that proves the rule, that there's very little else going on. We'd like to do more at NFER, but that also, that's reflected in the policy space as well, in terms of the more immediate challenge of actually getting the children in the school to try and help them seems to be very, very urgent. And then, of course, I must acknowledge the workforce challenges as well, because similarly, there are these basic things like getting the children in the school, getting the teachers in front of them, that we're lacking at the moment, that are both crises. And until we sort those basics out, then some of the other stuff around exactly what the most cost-effective means is of approaching the attainment of educationally, economically disadvantaged children is kind of a bit academic. So I would say we now just sort those out, those basics out. That's coming from an educationist point of view, though. There are these wider things that impact on those on the attendance potentially as well, that we've heard about. So mental health and so on, and health generally. So yeah, very complex picture, obviously, but yeah, I think we've got to sort the basics out, really.
It's an interesting point on workforce, because we haven't actually delved into it too much, but you've all mentioned it, which is, a lot of people say the biggest impact you can make for a disadvantaged kid, educational or economic, is a decent teacher in front of them, essentially, whether that's at EYFS post-16 or in the 5 to 16 environment. Let's go to you, Louise, on this. Like, do we know economically if teaching is seen as a viable career choice? Is a starting salary of a higher level really going to persuade people to come into teaching, or is it a bit softer than that? Are we talking about perceptions here?
Yeah, definitely a good question. As you say, sort of broadly speaking, kind of public sector wages is a big topic. I mean, I think it's be no surprise to anyone that generally the UK has had pretty sluggish wage growth over the past sort of 15 years or so, and that shows up particularly in some public sector jobs, including teaching. I can't say I'm an expert in terms of commenting on sort of the relative importance of pay compared to some of the other kind of quite well publicized things you hear about from surveys, just that kind of the extent of the workload, the stress, the sort of intensity of the job. But I think regardless of sort of the relative importance of all of those things, I think it's definitely fair to say that it's a hard, but as you say, very important job, and the pay has been sluggish in real terms, and I think there's just some interesting kind of more specific trends to think about. For example, we've seen these big rises in work from home across lots of sort of professional jobs that people that might be thinking about going into teaching could consider as alternatives, which by and large that work from home option isn't really there for people going into teaching. So there are these big considerations to think about. And just I think the other kind of sides of the coin, something that we've been thinking about, is just the increasing need for I guess wider health, well-being, kind of pastoral provision within schools. And there obviously have been big steps in that direction recently. For example, the kind of creation and rollout of mental health support teams in schools and colleges is definitely a step in the right direction. Again, from speaking to young people, that support is really valued. So not only kind of just the importance of having like a good inspirational teacher and what that can mean for them. But generally, we just heard having that wider pastoral support in schools and colleges is just what young people want. It's, you know, it's where they go every day. It's a place that they feel comfortable to get support. But again, on the flip side, what that means is just, you know, that comes with sort of staffing, funding challenges to make sure that those teams and that type of support is, you know, is viable.
And we've got a question. Oh,
Sorry,
Carol,
I should just say that there's another webinar in this series that deals with workforce led by my colleague Jack Worth. So that's, you know, there's all the detail there around bursaries.
into that one. Let's get promo somewhere for that one. Abby, someone's asked about professional learning in terms of teaching. So, you know, CPD essentially for teachers in tackling the disadvantage gap. And this is a big issue in the EYFS, obviously, where historically low wages, there's a perception crisis. Is it childcare? Is it education? You know, are we training these practitioners to be better carers of children, or actually in education? Do you have a view on that? Should there be a political push, if you like, to see 2 to 5 education as genuinely a preschool education rather than a childcare setting?
Yeah, such an interesting question. I mean, there's some levels to that. So I think the first level is, I think there's often a claim made around education as being we need to think about kind of early years professionals as educators, because somehow it's more valuable than being a carer. And my brief is across caring sort of in the round. And actually, I'd love to push against that a bit, because care is a really important and life-giving, you know, a very expert in many ways kind of profession. So that's the kind of first level. I think the second thing is, absolutely, we do not have enough of a focus in our system on quality and the kind of professional development of kind of early years kind of educators, carers, whatever you want to call them, and that is in stark contrast to our kind of European counterparts. There's some nuance there that actually childminders in this country are much more kind of regulated and expert actually than childminders elsewhere. So it's not, you know, it's not entirely the kind of picture, but generally we are not as focused on that. So absolutely, I think that just broadly, if we were to think of that kind of 2 to 5 kind of early years time as a pivotal time for children to learn, I think we would think differently about the kind of workforce that you would want there. But again, it's both childcare and it's education, and both jobs are extremely important. I think currently we're tipped too far on the childcare side, and I think we need to tip back slightly to education.
And Ben, I'm going to give you like a minute here, but have we got good evidence that good CPD improves teacher quality and retention? Like, do we know that if we get the CPD right, we get better teachers staying for longer?
Well, just to emphasize that we need a lot more of that in the early years sector, of course, because that's the weakness there, the quality. I completely concur with that. We were working on an evaluation where we were trying to improve CPD, and COVID got in the way. So absolutely agree with that. In terms of the role of CPD in schools, so a lot of the evaluations we work on look at CPD interventions that then you know, change practice and so on, and then we look at outcomes. So it's all in the mix of what we do. But in terms of whether it gets whether it helps teachers stay, there is a I think, I mean, we are doing some work on that at the moment, which isn't ready yet. But I think it's a you know, it's part of the mix of factors that can influence work, you know, the tendency for teachers to stay as opposed to leave. And you know, it's in the mix of this whole business around if you increase bursaries, you increase, they're very effective at increasing the flow of teachers into the profession, but you get a different mix of teachers when you do that, because you get teachers that are less experienced potentially than if you're paying higher salaries or retention payments and so on. So there's the whole business around teaching quality, which you refer to, is something which it's harder to get a handle on from a research perspective, but it's something that we are increasingly trying to do.
Thank you. I've overrun, which I always do. I apologise, but I thought it was worth round it off at that point. So I think we've had a really interesting discussion about tackling the disadvantage gap. Clearly, attendance is key. Clearly, teacher quality is key. Clearly, some joined up and innovative thinking around funding across the whole span of education is key. But most of all, I think, is that messaging from the politicians going into the election that this is the important point for future society, not just for education, and not putting all the onus for change onto an education establishment unless we're going to properly fund them to do so. So thank you to the panelists, thank you to the NFER for setting this up, and thank you for everyone for joining in.